On Wednesday the 3rd of February in 2021, a 39-year-old mother of two named Cynthia Bah-Traore had left her teenage son at home to babysit while she stepped out to run some errands. However, despite her plans to return home at 7:30 that evening, she would mysteriously never arrive. Around 2 hours later, Cynthia's son would call his grandmother Tambra Alvoid to let her know about the situation, as it was very unusual for Cynthia to be out this late on a weekday and to not be answering her phone. So, concerned for her daughter's safety, Tambra then called Cynthia's soon-to-be ex-husband to see if he knew where she was, and according to him, she had apparently been in some kind of accident and was recovering in the hospital. But after numerous phone calls, Tambra would continue to have no luck in tracking her daughter down, eventually deciding to wait until Cynthia reached out herself. However, the situation would only seem to escalate when the 39-year-old mother would fail to attend her divorce hearing, and it was later revealed by the police that Cynthia had actually been spotted at a gas station in Grandview, Texas, at around 10:35 p.m. the day she disappeared. The police also eventually found her car 2 weeks later abandoned next to Interstate 35 in Waco, Texas, with the keys inside and plenty of fuel in the tank. But despite the huge wealth of evidence that the police were able to uncover, after 3 years of investigating, she still remains missing to this day, which has understandably led many to wonder what really happened to Cynthia Bah-Traore, and more importantly, who could be responsible for her disappearance. Cynthia Martina Bah-Traore was born on the 14th of July in 1981 to her loving mother Tambra Alvoid in the city of Omaha, Nebraska, where she grew up with her two sisters. During her younger years, Cynthia was described by her mother as an extremely carefree child who, no matter what, always seemed to have a big smile on her face, and by all accounts, she also had a very generous spirit, as on multiple occasions she would save up her allowance to buy presents for local children who were in need. Growing up, Cynthia would continue to demonstrate these traits, alongside her relentless hard-working nature, so it was no surprise that she would excel in school both academically and socially, eventually earning herself a place at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. But upon graduating, she had decided to pursue a career in teaching, which meant that for the first time in her life, she would be moving away from her home city of Omaha, eventually landing in Crowley, Texas, where she became a fully qualified teacher. But in typical Cynthia fashion, she took this new challenge in her stride once again, and continued to excel as she always had done, quickly making friends at her local church and participating in many volunteer-based roles in her spare time. According to her family, Cynthia would even go on to volunteer at a prison ministry, which she found incredibly rewarding, as religion had always been a big part of her life, so being able to share her faith with those who needed it the most was truly a blessing. But her selfless deeds didn't stop there, as Cynthia would also begin to write and produce plays for her local community, and would always make time for the people in her life that she loved. However, it would seem that this caring personality would eventually attract a man named Mussolini, that many would argue was only ever out to take advantage of her kind nature. But wanting to stand by the person she loved, Cynthia would eventually settle down with this man, and together they had 2 boys. But despite her devoted love for the family, Cynthia began to see the cracks in her marriage when she noticed that her husband had been stealing from her bank account, and on top of this, she had also discovered that he had been lying about his immigration status, as he had allegedly used false information to enter the country. But the final straw for Cynthia was when her husband started having an affair, leaving her with no choice but to file for divorce. And it is at this point that our story takes an even darker turn, as just 2 days before the final hearing, Cynthia would mysteriously disappear. On Wednesday the 3rd of February, the 39-year-old woman said goodbye to her children as she headed out the door with the aim of returning home by 7:30 p.m. after running some important errands. Little was known about where she went that day, but once 7:30 had rolled around with still no sign of Cynthia, her eldest son noticed that this was very unusual for his mother, as given her job as a teacher, this meant that she was almost always on time. But assuming she may have just gotten stuck in some traffic, he wasn't too worried about it at first, and continued on with his night, relatively unfazed. But after noticing that the time had soon flown by, Cynthia's son quickly realised that she was now over 2 hours late, which understandably caused him a great deal of concern given how unprecedented this behaviour was. So, after attempting to call his mother with no success, he then decided to call his grandmother, Tambra Alvoyd, who was back in Nebraska at the time, to tell her about the situation in the hopes that she may have spoken to Cynthia and knew where she was. But once again, there would be no success, as Tambra had absolutely no idea why Cynthia wasn't answering her calls or why she would be so late returning home. So, concerned for her daughter, Tambra then assured her grandson that everything would be okay and that she would get to the bottom of this mystery. She then called every single family member or friend that may have known where Cynthia was and asked them if they had been in contact with her, but every conversation would unfortunately end the same. So with nowhere else to turn, Tambra swallowed her pride and dialed her daughter's soon-to-be ex-husband to see if he perhaps knew where she was. But the response she would soon receive would send shockwaves throughout her body, as according to Mussolini, Cynthia had actually been in an accident and was in the hospital recovering, which explained why she hadn't returned home and why she was unable to take any calls from her family. So, relatively relieved to hear that her daughter was alive, but still concerned for her health, Tambra then asked which hospital her daughter was at so she could call them directly to get an update. But strangely, after calling the local hospital in Crowley, the staff were unable to connect her as they were having trouble finding Cynthia on the system, advising her to try calling back later. However, little did Tambra know at the time that the reason they couldn't find Cynthia on the system was because she was never there. On Friday the 5th of February, Tambra Alvoyd would receive a message from one of her family members claiming that Cynthia had failed to show for her final divorce hearing that had been scheduled for months. Up until this point, Tambra had quietly held out hope that her daughter would have had to have come out of hiding for her divorce proceedings, as she knew how desperate Cynthia was to move on from her husband. So, when she didn't show, this set off some major alarm bells across the community, as despite believing she was at the hospital at the time, nobody had actually seen her since the night she walked out. With this in mind, Tambra then decided to try calling the hospital again, as she had been doing continuously throughout the previous 2 days. But just as before, the staff still couldn't locate Cynthia and had no record of her ever checking into the hospital. But on the following day, after several more attempts to get in touch with her daughter, the truth finally seemed to emerge, as a nurse would call Tambra back herself to confirm that not only was Cynthia not in the hospital, but that she had never even checked herself in. So upon hearing this troubling news, the reality of the situation quickly hit Tambra, as she realised that her daughter had been officially missing now for 3 days, meaning they had lost some valuable searching time and that Cynthia was more than likely in grave danger. But the situation would seem to go from bad to worse, when the grief-stricken mother would receive a phone call from the Crowley Police Department with news that would shake Tambra to her very core. On Saturday the 6th of February, the Crowley PD revealed to Tambra Alvoyd that a woman matching Cynthia's description had been captured on surveillance cameras getting into an unknown vehicle at a Shell gas station in Grandview, and according to the cashier, she had also left her cell phone on the counter. With this new information, I think it would be safe to say that the family were overwhelmed with worry, given that their loved one had disappeared without her cell phone and therefore had no way of contacting anybody if she was in trouble. So, given the escalation of the case, Tambra assumed that the police would step up their investigation, as Cynthia would have never left her kids behind, meaning the only other option was that she had to have been abducted by somebody that day. But despite their assumptions, the police surprisingly showed a complete lack of urgency towards the situation, with days soon turning into weeks, with very little progress being made in the investigation. According to the family, at this time they felt truly abandoned by the authorities, as they found it very difficult to believe that there could be no leads in a case that was so controversial. But despite the lack of effort on the police's side, Tambra and the rest of the family were determined not to give up, so they continued pressing the police for answers every single day, and eventually, they found some success, as the police would provide the family with 2 recordings from the night of Cynthia's disappearance at the gas station in Grandview, where you could clearly see her entering the store. But unfortunately, there really wasn't much else to see, And according to the family, there were supposed to be several other tapes that were not shared by the police, as they were being withheld for evidence. So, despite their efforts, Cynthia's family were once again sent back to square one, with very little knowledge of what happened that night, outside of the fact that she may have gotten into a stranger's vehicle. But even that wasn't confirmed, as the tapes were being withheld, so for all they knew, it was still possible that Cynthia could have got into her own vehicle at the time. Days would then pass with still no updates from the police, and the family's frustration only grew as their hope began to slowly fade. But thankfully, it wouldn't be too much longer before they would finally receive some more news from the Crowley PD, but their excitement would soon turn to dread when the police announced that they had made another startling discovery. On Sunday the 15th of February, a Texas Ranger on patrol would stumble upon what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle on the side of Interstate 35 in Waco, Texas. It was a metallic blue Mazda CX-5 with a Texas license plate, and after calling into the office, it was quickly revealed that this vehicle actually belonged to Cynthia Bah-Traore, who at this point had been missing for 12 days. So, given the troubling circumstances surrounding the vehicle, the police then gained access and searched the interior for any clues that may have led them to finding Cynthia. But upon entering the car, they were immediately shocked to see that the keys were still inside, along with a fuel tank that still had plenty of gas. The police then estimated that the vehicle was likely dropped off at this location between the 11th and the 15th of February, but rather controversially, rather than contacting the family right after finding the car, they instead chose to keep this evidence to themselves and only finally revealed their discovery 10 days later. But even more surprisingly, when explaining what they had found, the detective clearly stated that there were no keys found in the vehicle and dismissed any chances of foul play being involved, also stating that further examination was not required due to the cleanliness of the car and advised Tambra to pick up her daughter's vehicle later that day. However, it would seem that Tambra was far from satisfied by this explanation, as she would go on to question why she was only being told about this now, as according to Tambra, she had been calling the police daily for updates, and despite knowing what they knew about the vehicle, they chose not to tell her, which she found incredibly suspicious. But determined to keep her daughter's case alive, Tambra then begged the police to keep the vehicle and to run DNA testing to try and find any potential suspects that could have been driving the car that day, expecting her request to be met with understanding. However, despite her pleas, it would seem that the police were still not interested in pursuing this angle any longer, and insisted that she pick up the car at her nearest convenience, leading Tambra to feel like she had no other choice than to take her case to the mayor of Crowley. But after ultimately choosing to side with the police, Tambra realised that no authority figure was willing to take the case seriously, leaving her with a feeling of helplessness once again. So, refusing to give up hope, she then directly contacted a few DNA testing labs herself to see if they would be willing to test the vehicle for evidence, and initially, they expressed a strong willingness to help in the case. However, after speaking with the Crowley Police Department, the lab very controversially decided to reverse their decision, explaining to Tambra that the results of any testing would not provide admissible evidence to the courts, and therefore they refused to conduct any tests on the vehicle as originally promised. So once again, Cynthia's family were left deflated and hopeless, as it seemed that every single lead they would try to follow up on would immediately be shut down, meaning they were running out of options and were left at the hands of an unprofessional and unwilling police department that would continuously express their disinterest in the investigation. But there was still one more twist to the story that nobody saw coming, as Tambra would eventually decide to get in contact with the gas station cashier that had apparently called the police to report Cynthia's missing cell phone. But upon speaking with this man, she would soon find out some more information that would shine yet another light on the incompetence of the Crowley Police Department. On Thursday the 4th of March, the gas station cashier from the night Cynthia disappeared, named Ali, expressed to Tambra Alvoyd that he had in fact spoken to Cynthia that day. However, he did not remember her leaving her phone on the counter, and therefore he also did not call the police to report anything. So with this information, Tambra quickly realised that this meant the police had lied to her once again, and so she immediately called the detective to try and get to the bottom of this inaccuracy. But rather than receiving an apology, she was instead sent an email by the police that explained how they had made a mistake in their reporting, as the cell phone had actually been left inside a vehicle that Cynthia had climbed into that night. According to the email, she had actually got into what appeared to be a stranger's car at the gas station, and after leaving her cell phone inside the vehicle, that driver then called the police to report it. But this still didn't explain why they made up this story about the phone being reported by the cashier, as it simply didn't make any sense whatsoever. So, after reading the email and gathering her thoughts, Tambra then called up Lieutenant Tate, who was the person that was supposed to be overlooking this investigation. But despite Tambra's very understandable concerns, they surprisingly responded to her phone call with an extremely unprofessional outburst, where in their anger, they expressed their personal belief that Cynthia had left on her own accord that night, and therefore she would not be returning anytime soon. This then coupled with the fact that the police were not going to be looking into the case any further, as they believed it was a lost cause. And so, in this moment, Tambra realised that the police department had been working against them the entire time, and with the case now being over a month old, the reality of the situation had suddenly hit home, as Cynthia's return was now looking extremely unlikely. But the controversy didn't stop there, as in January of the following year, it was also revealed that the police had failed to send Cynthia's dental records over to the National Missing Persons database, despite promising to do so 10 months earlier. So, with this case being mishandled to such a huge degree, it was unfortunately left up to Cynthia's family to continue the search, with Tambra conducting several interviews with different media outlets to help spread the story. But despite these massive efforts from the family to keep the case alive, over 3 years later, Cynthia still remains missing to this day. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But one thing that is for sure is that Cynthia's family will continue to fight for justice, regardless of how many setbacks they receive, which I for one think is incredibly courageous and deserves to be highlighted. However, in the years since her disappearance, you cannot deny the fact that there has been very little media coverage around the case, with even some locals expressing their unawareness of the story. Therefore, all we can really do at this point is continue to spread the story, hoping that it will eventually receive the attention it deserves, and in doing so, perhaps we can finally get some answers around what really happened to Cynthia Bah-Traore. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, going forward on this channel I will only be discussing the theories that have been talked about by either the investigating police or the family themselves, as I do not want to cause any harm to the people connected to this case. So, with this in mind, there are two main theories which seem to stand out amongst the rest, which is that the police were somehow involved, or Cynthia's ex-husband could have been behind her disappearance. But to start with the latter, I think there are numerous arguments that point suspicion at Mussolini due to the coincidental nature of Cynthia's disappearance. As I mentioned previously, the hearing was supposed to take place on the 5th of February, and it is to my understanding that this would have been the final session before signing the papers and making the divorce official. So, the fact that she disappeared just 2 days before could suggest that her ex-husband may have been behind this, as he would have surely not been very happy to lose custody over his kids, or any of the other possible consequences of signing these papers. But to add to this, he also lied to Cynthia's mother about where she was, by stating she was recovering at the hospital, as this was later revealed to be completely false, meaning Mussolini was clearly trying to hide something. We also know from Cynthia's family that this man was a proven liar and manipulator, as he had falsified his immigration papers in the past. He had stolen money from Cynthia's bank account, and he had even had an affair behind her back. So, all of these details alongside the fact that he was set to lose custody over his children would surely provide a strong enough motive for Mussolini to make his soon-to-be ex-wife disappear. Unfortunately, this is a relatively common occurrence with missing person cases that involve divorce, so given the details surrounding this particular case, it certainly wouldn't be too surprising if he was guilty. However, taking a step back from this theory, regardless of whether or not Mussolini was behind this, the question that still remains is why were the police so unhelpful in their investigation, and why were they so certain that Cynthia had simply vanished on her own accord? Well, in order to answer these questions, we would probably require an interview with the police themselves, as from my research there isn't any mention of an explanation as to why they behaved so unprofessionally. It could be that they were simply overwhelmed with other investigations at the time, or maybe the officers just weren't prepared for a case of this nature. But either way, the manner in which they handled Cynthia's case was nothing short of despicable. Firstly, they didn't provide Tambra Alvoyd with all of the surveillance tapes at the gas station, meaning she was led to believe that her daughter had simply driven off on her own after forgetting her cell phone on the counter. But this was later revealed to be a lie, as Cynthia had never even left her cell phone at the gas station, as it was later explained that she had actually got into a stranger's vehicle and left her phone in this person's car. Perhaps the surveillance tapes would have proven to Tambra that the police had lied about their report, and so they wanted to keep it under wraps. Also, the police had initially promised to share Cynthia's story with the media, but after weeks of searching, the police had still not fulfilled their promise, leaving the family to have to reach out to the media themselves. This time delay could have very well been the difference between Cynthia being found or not. But one final argument to be made is that the police also didn't send Cynthia's dental records over to the National Missing Person database, as they had once again promised to do earlier on in the case. Instead, it took them almost 1 year to finally send the details over, showing just how uninterested they were in the investigation. One of the detectives even went as far as to say to Tambra herself that they believed Cynthia had left on her own accord and showed very little compassion for the grieving mother despite her desperate pleas for help. So with all of these details combined, I think we can all agree that this case could have been handled much better by the Crowley Police Department, as perhaps if they took it more seriously, we wouldn't still be here 3 years later asking questions that should have been answered back in 2021. But speaking of this year in particular, as I was researching Cynthia's case, I couldn't help but notice some parallels between her story and another, about a man named Eodis Harris, who had also disappeared from a town near Crowley just 4 months later. Now, if you're subscribed to the channel, then you would have probably seen my previous upload which covered the disappearance of Eodis Harris in a lot more detail. But if not, then I highly recommend checking out the video on screen now, as I'm sure you will be able to identify even more similarities in their cases that I haven't mentioned here. But either way, just for the sake of context, I will quickly provide a brief rundown of his story. So, on the 15th of June in 2021, a 32-year-old man named Eodis Harris was supposed to be walking his dogs during the middle of the night, when he would mysteriously disappear. The next morning, his mother Corlita would wake up to find a missed call from her son at around 4 AM. So given this strange occurrence, she attempted to call him back, concerned that Eodis may have been in trouble. However, after calling and leaving multiple voicemails, it became apparent that he wasn't answering his phone, which eventually led Corlita to check her son's social media, as he was a frequent user of Facebook. But upon opening the app, she quickly noticed that Eodis had left a barrage of cryptic messages on his Facebook page, discussing the traumatic events of his life, including his recent dismissal from the Fort Worth Independent School District. But the situation would only get worse when she would receive a call from the police later that day, explaining that her son's truck had been found abandoned with the keys left inside the vehicle. However, despite leaving behind numerous clues which related to several different suspects, somehow Eodis was still nowhere to be found, and after almost 3 years of investigating, the case remains unsolved to this day. Now, you may have already spotted a few similarities in that quick summary, such as the fact that both of their vehicles were left abandoned with the keys inside, but I can assure you, there are several more details that are even more suspicious. So firstly, both Cynthia's story and Eodis' story took place in Texas, just outside of Fort Worth, where they both worked as teachers, and were both affiliated with the Fort Worth Independent School District. Now, an important point to add here is that Eodis was fired from his teaching position at the school, as he was saying some incredibly controversial things on his Facebook about their quote-unquote dark secrets, with many arguing that this was the real reason behind his dismissal. I should say that this is only speculation, but given that he would disappear just a few days after leaving a string of posts aimed at vilifying the school, it is certainly suspicious that he would go missing within such close proximity. However, on top of this, another similarity in their cases is that after they went missing, there was very little police involvement and even less media attention, which, considering the controversial details surrounding their cases, this to me seems extremely odd. Surely every news broadcasting network would have wanted to cover their stories, but for some reason, in both cases, the families had to reach out for media coverage themselves. Now, another more superficial point to add would be that both victims were people of colour and in their 30s, which, although maybe nothing more than a coincidence, could also be the reason why they received less media attention than they deserved. You could also argue that both Eodis and Cynthia may have been targeted due to their skin colour, but this has not been a proven theory talked about anywhere from what I've seen, so I think I'll leave that one up to you to debate in the comments. But regardless of whether or not you agree that these cases possess some eerily similar details, I think one thing we can all agree on is that these missing victims have families that are still without closure after 3 years, and so we need to do everything we can to keep their stories alive until we can finally get some answers. So with this in mind, please feel free to share these stories with anybody you know that might have some information worth presenting to the family. I will also leave a link to their GoFundMe pages where you can leave donations and contact them directly with any evidence you may have. Anyway, with that, I think I'll leave this video here, but if you have any theories of your own which you think may help explain what really happened to Cynthia Bah-Traore, please leave your ideas in the comments down below and I will do my best to get back to you. But until then, thank you so much for watching and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these cases. Also, if you haven't already, make sure to check out the video on screen now where I cover the disappearance of Eodis Harris in a lot more detail.